It's a real pleasure to be here. I have not been to the lab school before, although I have heard so many rave reviews from not just clients but friends who have kids here, so I'm thrilled to be here tonight. And I am a psychologist in McLean. I have sort of a unique practice. I only work with parents on parent-related things. So I do that all day long, and then I go home to my own 3 children who are elementary, middle, and high school, so I feel like I've got it all covered. And, who have, in my household, there are learning differences, there's ADHD, so I'm very much in the trenches, and I love what I do, in part because it's so challenging, but also because I know there is so much that we as parents can, how we can have an effect on our kids and on our family. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart because parenting is hard and stressful. And, kind of life in 2017 can be hard and stressful, and there's a lot I feel that we can do about it if we think about it, yes. So laugh more, is going to pop up here and there because it's really important to maintain a sense of humor because there is so much pressure on us. Parenting is very challenging to begin with. And then there are our kids who keep going around and changing. And so if you've had that experience where you're kind of in a groove and then it's like the wheels fell off, you didn't imagine it. Your kids have probably hit a different developmental stage. For sure, our parenting needs to evolve and grow as our kids are growing. And that can be tough on us. Another thing that's tough on us is that there is a lot of information out there about parenting. You all know that. A lot of it's bad. Bad meaning counter to what research psychologists have figured out is how kids develop and, kind of some basics of motivation and behavior. So, there's some really good information out there and then there's some not so good information, and it's virtually impossible sometimes to know the difference. And then we have, of course, learning differences, which add an extra layer of stress and can make parenting even more challenging. I'm a big believer that if we think about, kind of what we're trying to achieve big picture with our kids, that can really help take off some of the stress and pressure on us. It can be hard to remember to do because the day-to-day can be so all-encompassing. But, I'll talk a little bit more about that today. I do think that, if we can kind of hit the pause button, that it actually can make things easier. And then I'm a research psychologist at heart, and so I'm also a big believer that there is good information out there that is just not readily available to us as parents. And so I hope to give you some of that tonight to help guide you as you go. Here is, my favorite psychological theory from some great social psychologists, and I think it's like such useful information for parents. So I'm going to take 1 minute. I promise it's the only, kind of really theoretical piece I'm going to give you. But the truth is that all behavior is motivated, and our kids' behavior is not very well disguised for a lot of different reasons. And so even when we're unclear why they're doing what they're doing, there's a reason. And, in kind of very broad terms, it can usually fall into one or more of these 3 buckets, kind of what goals they're trying to achieve. One of the things that drives our kids' behavior is the desire to become competent, to learn new things. When kids learn new things, they gain competence leads to confidence, which leads to self-esteem. It is not always academic competence. It is not always competence in anything we as adults value, but for sure, your kids are looking for ways to become more competent and feeling good when they do. You're going to hear a lot more about connection tonight because it is such a fundamental piece of our kids' well-being and our own well-being as parents. It is the source of our influence with our children, and it's really crucial that all of us as human beings feel unconditionally loved and also to feel seen and understood. And our kids really need that from us. And you're all sitting here on a Wednesday night. I don't doubt the unconditional love that is flowing through this room. But I do know that it sometimes gets a little bit twisted around where kids are concerned. Their own sort of point of view and doubts and insecurities can maybe color it. And Most challenging is the fact that they are growing and changing rapidly. And we are sort of sometimes lagging behind a little bit. We are such good observers of them across a lifetime that we're sometimes, our views can be colored by what we remember or what we expected or what we thought. There are some, communications techniques that can really help us stay current with our kids that I'll talk about briefly. And then the third one is this need for autonomy, which is, you're going to hear from Bill Stixrud later, this lecture series. I hope you all come. He's a wonderful, wonderful person and lecturer. And he talks a lot about this too, this need for self-efficacy. We have this fundamental need to be in control on some level of, have some say in what happens to us. And some kids are just really, really high in this need for autonomy, just as their temperament. It's present in everybody, but, I would say that my practice of parents has a very disproportionately high percentage of parents who have one of these kids who is like, they want to control what happens. These are the kids that often power struggle, the ones that can be really oppositional, the ones where you think, why on earth would they do that? It seems so counterproductive. But they're kind of craving that autonomy and trying to find it in all different ways. There are a lot of ways that we as parents can feed their need for autonomy in positive ways that don't disrupt their goals or ours. So those are sort of just the three basic things. This is kind of my slide that I feel obligated to put up. I think you all probably know, and many of you probably saw the New York Times article that just came out last week about anxiety in teens that has gotten a lot of attention. You don't need to sort of take all of this in. It's simply, if you can look at it later if you want, but it's simply to illustrate that the mental health of this generation, is worse than previous generations. The numbers are on the rise, and this is what propelled me to open my practice, because I was so shocked initially years and years ago when I read these numbers and just realized how much anxiety, depression, and other issues are affecting our kids. And where, which kids. The researchers themselves were shocked to find that it was, across many socioeconomic classes, but particularly affluent, well-educated families. So we're here tonight not to dive deeply into anxiety or other mental health concerns. You have another great speaker coming to do that. But we're looking at kind of the, kind of precursor, if you will, at the stress that is rampant on everyone and what we can do about that, and hopefully how we can manage that and not have it lead any further. So I mentioned that I'm grounded in research. I'm going to tell you when I'm not, and that would basically be this slide, which is my kind of interpretation, hypothesizing based on the research that I've read and the families that I've worked with. People always want to know, why are those numbers so high? So I'm going to run real quickly through a few of these. More is food for thought, because what I'm much more interested in is what we can do about it. But, if you're kind of wondering, of course, academics, kindergarten today does not look like kindergarten used to. You who are parents here at this school have a big advantage because you're in a school that understands and level sets appropriately. So, that maybe it's not such a big deal here at the lab school. Extracurriculars are just more time consuming. It is no longer a once a week deal to play a sport, for example, or to dabble in an instrument. We have really ramped up the time commitments for a lot of things. This is one that is particularly important and, frankly, pretty easy to change as parents. Thank you, Carol Dweck, another brilliant social psychologist, for figuring out that the language that we use and what we focus on with our kids can have a huge impact not only on their performance, but on their, kind of motivation and stress. So really, in a nutshell, what we want to do is focus on what our kids can control, which is their effort, not on what they can't always control, which is the outcome. And we are right now in a time in society where there is incredible, intense vision into kids' performance, their achievement. We're measuring everything. It's, everybody else sees what's going on. It's just a really sort of extrinsic world that they're living in, and that creates a lot of stress. And so if we as parents can focus on the effort, that can be a little bit of a balm to some of this performance focus. Then you've got, technology. Again, you have a speaker on that. I encourage you to come and dig more into that, because that is a topic that is sort of changing. The research is constantly, kind of getting updated. It's pretty new, frankly, in terms of, like longitudinal study type things. But we know for sure that these kids today are living under such connectivity in ways that can be good, but also ways that can be very, very stressful. So if you think back to your own childhood or adolescence, I know when I had a bad day at school, I would just go home and essentially hide. I'd read a book or listen to music or, watch TV or do something to just, kind of let it pass. Our kids cannot particularly do that. They can unplug, and I encourage you to set some limits and encourage your kids to learn how to unplug. But, kids know when they're on and when they're off. It just is sort of this baseline expectation for kids to be, kind of in contact with one another. Again, I think it's really important for us as parents to put some bounds around that for our kids and to talk about it. But it is an extra pressure that can create stress. And then you have this awareness piece. That is, it is hard for us as adults to understand when somebody is putting something out on social media that they are essentially controlling the message. They're choosing how to present themselves, usually in a very favorable light, usually, a little retouched, varnished, glossy way, not the kind of warts and all, this is how it really is kind of way, which is the way we are usually sitting there reading it. And, how many of us have looked at somebody else's posting or picture or whatever and, kind of felt a little like, what am I doing wrong? I'm not feeling so gleeful and joyful and, all of these wonderful things. That's just a function, on some level of how our brains, take in social information. But for our kids, it's virtually impossible for them, in part just by their level of brain development, to fully understand that kind of a mismatch. And so, again, the pressure that gets created on them, the stress from that connectivity is significant, I think. The other thing is, what are we missing out on? If we're spending more time on schoolwork, more time on extracurriculars, time using technology online, what are we getting less of? That would be, the face-to-face interaction that we're hardwired to crave and to feel good about. And it would be the downtime that is crucial to developing kind of a strong sense of self and, healthy psychological development. So, that's something I'm going to touch on again that I think we can do to reduce some stress on our kids, is to add that back in. And then there's us. We all mean really, really well. But sometimes in our desire to support and, kind of our own anxiety perhaps, or, a whole myriad of reasons, sometimes we do a little too much for our kids. And that has effects, and that can, kind of read to them as a vote of no confidence. That can create a little bit of stress on our relationship, for sure, in some cases, and more broadly sometimes. And then there's all the things about college and, those horrible acceptance numbers, and I could go on about that, how those are goosed up for ages. And then there's just, kind of the wider world that we live in. So I think all of these factors create a lot of stress. I feel obligated to point out a real positive that I see in those numbers, which is that we are far better at detecting and treating a lot of these mental health conditions, and that's a huge win for the numbers to increase, because we're catching things and knowing about it. So it's not all bad news. All right, then we've got those of us who have learning differences in our families. That adds another layer of complexity, and there's all different kinds of complexities, but when we're thinking about what puts stress on our children and us, that certainly does. One little example, of course, is that ADHD has high concurrence with anxiety, like around 33%, I think, is the latest I've read. But it's just really important for all of us to manage stress, not just to help our kids manage their stress, but to manage our own. Emotions are contagious. They really are. And our kids catch our discomfort and stress and anxiety the same way you have probably found when your kids are highly emotional, your blood pressure starts to rise. And so, it's a two-way street. And you may have come tonight thinking we were going to talk all about how to help your kids stress less, which we are. But we also need to look at ourselves because we have a big effect by virtue of our own well-being or lack thereof, as well as the ways that we can parent our kids. Here you have a tremendous advantage. You have some fantastic resources at this school that can help reduce some of the stress. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of support. And I love, I have to thank you all for showing up in person, by the way. I mentioned when things are videotaped, I'm always slightly surprised that people will drag themselves out on a busy evening to come live. But part of what can happen is, hopefully you kind of chat with each other a little bit, if not tonight, another time, because parents can be the greatest support for other parents. We can really, kind of share the load a little bit. Or sometimes, if we're not careful, we can exacerbate some of the stress and spin each other up a little bit. So, try to be mindful as you're talking with other parents to, walk the side of that line that's helpful to everyone. But it can be really, really beneficial to, kind of share our emotions with other parents rather than let them bleed out into our kids. All right, so here's what I'm focusing on for the rest of tonight, because this is my passion, is what we can do about it. There are so many ways that we as parents can make changes in how we interact with our kids, both ways small and large, that have, really noticeable and sometimes almost immediate changes in our kids, in their stress level, in their behavior, in kind of the whole family happiness. So we're going to go through all of these today, and we're going to start with the idea of, kind of some basics about stress, because I think it's really important for kids to understand what is stress, what does it feel like in their bodies, to develop the awareness so that then they can access some ways to reduce it. So at a very basic level, when we feel stress, it triggers our fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system. There is a whole host of physical changes in our bodies that are very real. And so, when kids are reporting physical symptoms, if they're stressed or worried, those are real. And those are grounded in, kind of this evolutionary response to danger. And so we have evolved brilliantly to be able to flee the bear. When you think about kind of what are the changes happening, one of the changes that's happening that's most notable for us as parents is that the blood kind of leaves the rational, logical, higher ordered thinking part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex, because that's not helpful, right? When you're fleeing mortal danger, you don't want to stop and analyze and evaluate. You don't want to do anything that slows you down. You want to act. You want to mobilize. You want to go. That's great for the once in a while, run away from the bear. Not as great for the kind of lower level day-to-day kinds of stresses. And so what we see in kids who feel stress frequently and kind of haven't developed great ways to manage it yet is some of these types of symptoms. Again, they're real. They're real headaches. They're real stomach aches. I often get parents who come to me after having, taken their kids to all kinds of, GI specialists, for example, when there are stomach issues and other things. And they're real, GI symptoms happening. But if the cause of those, the root cause has to do with stress or anxiety and emotions, then, the GI doctor alone cannot really, fix that. And so the challenge for us as parents is there are multiple causes of everything on this list. And so it's kind of how do you know what's going on? In general, kind of in sort of a very brief heuristic, you're looking for sort of symptoms that are persistent, and you're looking for the context clues for sort of what are the situations and, are these kind of common? Are they coming up again and again so that, some other external cause maybe isn't doing it? But there are a lot of things on this list. Again, we all feel some of these things. Some degree of stress is healthy, frankly. And, we're not meant to be perfectly controlled robots. I mean, part of what makes us interesting as human beings is the range of emotions. But when these types of symptoms are cropping up again and again, and we're seeing this in our kids, then it is, a little bit of an alert that we want to think a little bit about the stress. So there are a few things I think are important for us as parents to realize about chronic stress. That's, again, kind of the over and over and over again type of stress. And at the most basic level, we are not really evolved to handle that well. Again, lots of research, looking at everything from sort of the effects of the cortisol in the bloodstream and how that can affect inflammation and how that can affect all of these different parts of the body. We do not want to we want to once in a while kind of have that fight or flight response go. Here's something that sometimes really freaks people out. Our children, and in particularly our adolescents, are in this really unique and crucial period of brain development. And kind of what they're doing at that moment is disproportionately strongly represented in kind of how their neural networks prune. And so if they're under intense stress, that will, they're finding that seems to be reflected in the way the brain even gets wired. So again, we just, we again all experience some stress, but we really want to take it seriously if there's too much. Sleep is remarkably effective, actually, at a whole number of issues with kids, emotional issues and others. And so one of the first things to look at is, are they getting enough sleep? Another thing is to look at the messages that we're giving them, because the wider society is kind of giving this message that more is better. And just keep adding it in, cramming it in, take the energy drink, eat the chocolate bar that's been infused with extra hit of caffeine, kind of keep chugging away. And we as parents can send a different message if we want. And I think it's important, if we believe that chronic stress is bad, that it's important to share that with our kids and to try to glorify taking breaks and having fun and laughing and building in some of that joy. And then I do think it's really important for us as parents to be knowledgeable about stress and anxiety's effects and to educate our kids on that. And an awful lot of schools are also doing the same thing as it becomes more and more apparent that kids are, again, under pressure. So, all right, brief little bit. This is the social psychologist version of the brain. If you had a neurologist up here, it would be a lot more complicated. But for what we need to know, I think, as parents tonight, this is enough. Because basically, the important thing to recognize is the colorful parts, more or less, are the limbic system. That's sort of the seat of all of our strong emotions. The little purple part there, that's the amygdala, is particularly impactful where anxiety and fear type responses are concerned. But it is the first part of the brain to develop. The prefrontal cortex, which is that kind of front brainy looking part there, is the last part to develop. You've probably heard this already about executive functions and how we think that the prefrontal cortex doesn't really fully develop until somewhere in the mid-20s. Longer if you're a boy versus a girl, longer if you have ADHD, all of these different factors. But the bottom line for us as parents is that our kids are sort of operating from a much more emotional place than we are as parents. And one of the biggest things that I see when parents come to me is that they are trying to parent in this very rational, very verbal, very logical, reasonable way. And it's not where their kids are at, probably both sort of developmentally and, in that moment. And so understanding that sort of, our kids are in a little bit more limbic, emotional realm can help us. There's some communication techniques that I'll touch on later that have to do with how do you talk to the emotions. Because again, where stress is concerned, that's an emotional response on some level. A couple other little nuggets, if you haven't heard them before, again, has to do with this idea of the brain getting kind of pruned down during those teenage years. And so, we just don't want the conditions to be those of chronic stress. The good news is that, learning is at its peak, but that also makes the teen brain vulnerable because addiction is essentially a form of learning. So what can we do about it? Again, I promised you, some ideas for solutions here. And one of them is to talk about coping skills. So the good news, sort of, is that we are not built to be we're not built to be under chronic stress. We're not built to have that fight or flight response going over and over again. And so we sort of do have innate ways to turn it off. The bad news is those tend to be sort of quick fixes that don't really resolve some of the deeper issues where our kids are concerned. things like avoidance, right? It feels lousy to be under that fight or flight response. And so, kids don't want to feel that way. They like to avoid the things that cause them stress sometimes. Sometimes that's even literally avoiding school as a whole, along with many, many other things. Another thing that I hear the most about probably are the outbursts. Temper tantrums don't only happen with toddlers. They happen all the way. I've got 20-year-old temper tantrums, examples of this. But it is because there's this physical energy that needs to get released. And sometimes that's, kind of the easiest way available to kids. And then there are other things. Sometimes they try to co-opt us or, other people or, other shop their way out of their pain, et cetera. But, there are a lot of ways that we try to get rid of those. There are also a lot of wonderful, healthy ways to reduce stress. And this is where we as parents can have a huge impact because kids, first of all, need a little bit of coaching, oftentimes, to understand what makes them feel better when they feel stressed. And so one of the things we can do is offer them some ideas based on our intimate knowledge of them, our expertise on them, and then we can kind of give them the little feedback loop. So it goes something like this. First of all, I mentioned, I put the brain slide up there for a reason because when they are feeling very emotional, it's not a good time for learning. And so, you don't want to have sort of a conversation about trying to coach them into figuring out some positive coping skills when they're upset or stressed out or angry or anxious or any of those things. You've got to pick your moment when they're, a little bit calmer and available to you to talk. And then, you want to just sort of highlight to them that, you want to give them some observations. Here's what I noticed. Here's, kind of how you seemed. A little empathy is always useful. One of the best things we can do as parents is to empathize in part, to kind of just share with them that's a healthy way to share their load and to build the connection. It's also a great way to build some emotional awareness in our kids as they grow. So, empathy is a great step. And then finally, you can move into a little bit of the meat of the conversation where you can say, so what could you do next time you feel X? And, you want to, I mentioned that autonomy for a reason, because no kids particularly, but really none of us like people to just tell us what to do necessarily. Your kids, particularly when they feel this need for autonomy, would much prefer us to ask them for ideas, and let them evaluate our ideas. And so you want this to be a little bit like Jeopardy, a little bit like, do you have any ideas of what might help you? No? Okay. Well, what if you tried? I wonder if you did this, what would happen? You want to just couch it, in a way that allows them to think about it, try it on, figure out if it's going to work for them or not. You want, the list here is tiny, tiny compared to, kind of the universe of things that can make any individual person feel better. You can model what makes you feel better. That can be very impactful where you share. When I am really stressed, I find that it helps if I do X. When you are in the heat of moment and you are feeling very frustrated, very stressed, very angry, that is a great time to think out loud and to say, I am feeling really stressed out, and so I am going to go for a walk. And then, you do it. And, that's a great way to teach. But one of the things, when we look at the research, there's a couple tried and true. Breathing, for sure, because we can't turn off that fight or flight response except for the breathing. That's the only piece of that we have conscious control over. And we cannot, it's incompatible to have slow respiration with a rapid heartbeat. So if we can get those slow, deep, controlled breaths. Most kids despise being told to take deep breaths when they're in the heat of the moment. It is a challenge. You must try to work that in calm times, make it part of bedtime, make it part of car rides, have them practice it. Because the coping skills, the thing about them is that, again, when kids are starting to feel stressed, that is not a good time for them to stop and think carefully, evaluate options, run through their list in their mind. That is the time where they need to have kind of some, pre-planned habits, semi-automatic responses that they can just go to. And so they have to practice it in times of calm in order to have it kind of locked in there for when they get stressed out. So, that's one that works, when they're willing to do it, is pretty foolproof. There's a lot of research on the mindfulness and the meditation, the idea of grounding in the present, how impactful that can be. Research about that we feel calmer outdoors than indoors, for example. So, there are some of these that, we can feel pretty confident are good. But again, your child. And so give them some options, work through it with them. Again, help them evaluate, how did you feel when you did X? I noticed you seemed calmer. Is that right? Lots of questions like that, good conversations, but build up that arsenal of positive coping skills in your kids. And again, the research shows, if the list on the bottom frightens you at all, the more access they have to tools that are positive, the less they're going to do those risky behaviors. So there you go. All right, strengthening connections. I mentioned how crucial this is and how much power and control we have over this as parents. Kids need an unconditionally loving bond. It's really the foundation for resilience and psychological health. But it feels pretty darn good with us too, right? Like this is, the joy of parenting is feeling that deep connection and, the enjoyment of being together. Of course, there are many difficult times. Of course, family life is not always smooth sailing. But, if we work at this, then the rewards are there. And one of the ways we can work at this is to really try to stay current with our kids, because they are changing rapidly, especially as they get into adolescence. They're kind of having a lot of self-identity confusion and mood swings and all of these things happening. And they like nothing less than us making assumptions for them. That will immediately trigger stress response all around the room. So you want to, kind of ask questions. What do you think about this? What's your opinion of that? Help me understand where you're coming from. Those kinds of, again, good communication skills can really enhance that connection. So, we want to try to set aside maybe what we thought we knew. In some cases, sometimes we parents have to dig a little bit. Sometimes we are carrying around kind of assumptions for, wishes for what we kind of hope our child will be like, could be like, is going to be like. And that can cloud our vision a little bit. So, we really want to pay attention to our connections to reduce stress on both sides of the parent-child relationship. Resilience is a huge topic and a crucially important one. And fortunately, you have a speaker coming for that. But, just in sort of a basic math problem of, when you look at stress, there are kind of, if there's too much stress, you kind of have two choices. One is to reduce the amount of stress. There are some ways we can do that and some ways that frankly we cannot. But you do have a second choice, which is if you increase resilience, then that essentially increases the capacity to manage stress. It increases the amount of stress that we can sort of successfully handle. So it's really important to think about resilience when we're thinking about stress. And, we need to watch ourselves as parents, because sometimes in our very well-intentioned efforts to love and support our children, sometimes we overdo it a little bit, and that does weaken, their resilience if we're too big on it. Question was, could I give some specific examples of effective communication and of how overparenting weakens resilience? So I'm going to give you a real short now and longer when there's Q&A at the end, just in the interest of everyone's time. But, one thing I would say, if she mentioned that sometimes when she tries to have conversations, they sort of explode. Yes, I would say. Okay, adolescent, so, doesn't always like that. One big thing to look at is your timing. Because if you are not catching him when he is sort of emotionally and mentally available to have the conversation, you're pretty doomed. So a lot of times we pick the timing that works really well for us, but it has to work for him. He has to be in a calm clear place. And then, the way the conversation would look is if there was a particular, say there was an outburst or a problem that had happened, you kind of just very briefly, short and sweet, state what that was. When I spoke to you earlier about needing to clean your room, you screamed and stormed off. A little empathy. I understand you were having a rough day and you did not want to think about your room, and that's a sore subject for you, whatever whatever empathy is authentic and appropriate. And then you move into the, however, we still need to be able to have tough conversations, and I need to say sometimes, I need to tell you that there are things, responsibilities that you have in this household that you may not enjoy or like, and you need to be able to hear me calmly and reasonably, and we need to be able to have a discussion. So help me understand where you were coming from, and let's figure out together how this can work. And you kind of see if he says anything. If he doesn't want to talk about it, then you can kind of say, okay, well, I'm open to feedback, but, given that you don't have any concrete suggestions, I'm wondering if it would be better if I alerted you kind of at the beginning of the day and then dropped it, for example. How would that work for you? And you're trying to get him to, kind of concur to whatever degree an adolescent will concur, right? Which sometimes is, silent, but, you're trying to just reach some little action plan resolution, and then you test it out and you repeat the conversation a day or a week later if it hasn't improved. If it has improved, you definitely notice and appreciate that improvement. Do not forget to sort of reinforce when there is positive change, and things like that. So, and bring me back to it at the end, okay, if we need to. The same thing with overparenting. So what do I mean by that? And I'll give you a really specific example that affects many of us here. When our kids have a learning difference, the temptation is strong sometimes to provide a lot of support to them. We need to just remember that anything we're helping them with, they are not completely owning on their own. And there are times where they need that help, and that's appropriate, and that's good, and the help is in order to, kind of let them develop into being able to do something. Sometimes, though, they've sort of mastered that particular skill, and we haven't quite caught up to them yet. And in that case, if they can do it without us, let's say it's as simple as remembering to bring, an instrument or their gym bag or whatever it is to school, and they've figured out, okay, Tuesday is, instrument day. If we're constantly sort of, don't forget, Tuesday's instrument day, it can read to them as like a little vote of no confidence. It can read to them as, maybe I need some help with this. Not overtly consciously, this is all happening on a lower level, but it doesn't feel great to them, and it does sort of make it harder for them to, kind of manage when there are mistakes. We have to be careful. We want our kids to do well, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but we have to be careful not to sort of artificially prevent them from, stumbling here and there. And I put on here that you're going to have, you have 2 other great opportunities to hear speakers on really this topic, resilience and the need for control, autonomy, that is just crucial to that sense of resilience. So we can come back to this at the end, but hand in hand with resilience is failure. And, this is something that I just feel so strongly about, because one of the things that's so stressful on kids is feeling like they have to sort of get everything right, to feel like mistakes are bad, to feel like we expect them to be able to do things, or other people expect it, or a lot of times they internalize it, and they have a little bit of perfectionism where they want to try to kind of hit everything without mistakes. That is really stressful. And so this is something that as parents, we can message this, we can live this, we can model this very, very effectively if we tune into it. So we want to make sure that we are letting our kids know that, if you already know how to do something the first time, you haven't really, you haven't learned anything new. And that when you're trying to learn something new, it's going to be, trial and error. Don't forget the error part. It's going to be success and failure. And that there is a lot to be learned from the failure, and that it's not to be feared, and that it can be a real strength to be able to do that. So, again, we're not really in a point in time in our culture where we love to talk about failure. That's part of sort of that, self-presentation that people are putting all of their successes out there and not as much of the underbelly. But we need to make sure that we're allowing our kids to do this. This is always a fear of virtually every parent, and I do understand it. And I feel it sometimes. But I think this goes back to where we ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to sort of, win the battle or win the war, right? Like, do we want our kids to, we can either optimize kind of their performance in a specific setting or scenario, or we can optimize the skill development for them to be able to be successful across a lot of different domains. So, sometimes allowing them to stumble and slip and even fall behind in certain ways is absolutely appropriate and useful. And so we just need to remember, development is asynchronous in, virtually every kid, and that's okay. It's not something to, we get in the pattern of really sort of over attending to the weaknesses and not really paying as much equivalent attention to the positives and the strengths. When we're thinking about stress, we can greatly reduce their stress by just putting more attention on their competencies, on their strengths, than on their weaknesses. Just looking at that balance can be really effective. If you have older kids, there is so much to work with in this particular speech, the Man in the Arena speech by Theodore Roosevelt. The first sentence talks about kind of what to do for people, the naysayers in the world, how to kind of approach that. And then, he gets into the glory is in the trying, in the effort, not in the outcome. So that's a wonderful little speech, if you're not familiar with it, to read and to talk through with your kids, especially if they're a little bit older, and ask them, again, open-ended questions. What do they think about that? Can they think of a time that they've tried something and failed, etc. If you have younger or older kids, the genius of Dr. Seuss, he has got some, really a brilliant little way to build in this conversation right into this book, where he hits head on the fact that sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail, and it happens to everyone. So talk about normalizing failure. You cannot go wrong with Dr. Seuss. But again, talk to your kids about that. I mentioned the research. This is sort of, a broad compilation of literally hundreds and hundreds of different people's studies. But, the same, it doesn't seem to matter all that much how they operationally define things like happiness and success, because the same characteristics tend to bubble up over and over again. And so, just for you to think about, some of the things that are really important are resilience for sure. Self-control we can talk about more in the Q&A, but in our kind of on-demand world, it is much harder for kids to develop self-control than it was once upon a time when we had an awful lot of waiting and pauses and patience built into our everyday lives. So that's a really crucial one. And then, there are other things on this list that we've either talked about or can talk about more. But again, as you're trying to decide what to do to reduce stress, we can nurture and encourage every one of these characteristics as parents in different ways. So we can come back to that, but I will give you sort of the simplest and in many ways one of the most effective things we can do. The literature on happiness is pretty interesting because of course there are nuances, but it's not too bad of an oversimplification to say that practicing gratitude, focusing on what you're grateful for, thinking positive thoughts is profoundly impactful on our stress levels and our happiness. And so, when we're trying to figure out all of these different things we can do to reduce stress, daily conversations about what you're grateful for is a pretty powerful technique to use. So that's your simplest one of the night. Another thing I mentioned again was this not overparenting, this encouraging independence. I'm going to give you again the 60-second version of what is another hour talk. So bear with me, and we can come back to it again in the Q&A. But essentially, to build independence in our kids, we need to give them more freedom and more responsibility. It's ideal when those can kind of go together. It's always going to be a little push and pull. Our kids often want more freedoms than we are ready to give, or perhaps they are even developmentally ready for.